Hello, my name is Isaac, and this is the Casual Dex. On this channel, I'm working through a long-term project to systematically test which Pokemon are actually good in a casual playthrough. In my previous video, I explained the full methodology for how these tests work, but here's the short version. I semi-randomly generate a team of Pokemon that can theoretically cover every type. Then I complete a full playthrough of a game where that team is available, and at the end of the run, I evaluate how each Pokemon performed. However, I actually started this project before I decided to publish the results. Because of that, there are 4 completed playthroughs that are already part of my dataset, but I didn't take detailed notes while doing them. So instead of doing a full breakthrough like future videos will have, this video and the next will serve as a short recap where I go over those teams and talk about how they performed overall. After this, future runs will follow a more structured format. The way I ran my test in Pokemon Violet is slightly different from how I'll run tests in most other games. Because Paldea is an open world region, traditional route progression doesn't really exist. In older games, you can't reach high-level areas until you've earned certain badges, but in Scarlet and Violet, you can technically walk into areas with very high-level Pokemon almost immediately, and it's sort of unclear as to where to go when, by design. To deal with this, I used my starter to catch each Pokemon I planned to test, then bred them and hatched an egg for each one. This allowed me to start the playthrough with all 6 team members at level 1. If every game allowed this, it would probably be my preferred method, but most regions have roadblocks that prevent it. For this run, my team was Pawmot, Talonflame, Dugtrio, Slowkicks, Tatsugiri, and Swalot. Since I didn't take notes during this playthrough, this recap is based mostly on what I remembered throughout the run. Fletchling immediately made an impact by sweeping Katie's Bug Gym, which was a great early start. Tatsugiri performed extremely well against Cloth the Rock Titan. Gulpin was able to defeat Brassius, although I don't remember exactly how close that fight was. I do remember Pomo struggling against Bombardier, but ultimately winning thanks to some careful potion use, because you can't heal between the 2 Bombardier fights. Unfortunately, I don't remember anything about the Giacomo fight, but I do remember being disappointed in Diglett's performance against Iono. That said, I'm willing to give it some leeway there because Iono's team is designed specifically to reduce the ground type advantage that you'd normally have against electric types. But unfortunately, that trend continued, and Dugtrio continued to disappoint in several later fights, including Mela and the Orthworm Titan. In the case of Orthworm, that was partially my fault for forgetting about the Earth Eater ability, but Paldea in general seems to do its best to make Pokemon that should be weak to ground, not weak to ground. I don't remember much of anything from the Kofu fight, but I do remember being happy with Pawmot's performance during it. Unfortunately, Dugtrio also struggled during the Atticus fight. Later on, Pawmot swept Larry's gym, while my memory of the Montanevera gym is unfortunately fairly fuzzy. I also don't remember the details of Iron Treads, Alfornada, or Glaciato gyms, but I do remember being satisfied with Swalot's performance against the Fairy Squad and Talonflame's performance against the Fighting Squad. Now for the Pokemon League, I actually do have some notes from the run. I was a little disappointed with Talonflame. I couldn't give it a strong physical fire-type move that really took advantage of its attack stat, which made it less useful against Poppy and against Geeta. I was also very disappointed with Dugtrio. Its offensive power simply wasn't high enough to knock out opponents before they hit back. I tried to sweep Poppy with it, but it was knocked out immediately. When I used it against Geeta's Kingambit, the same thing happened. Tatsugiri, on the other hand, blew my expectations away. It struggled somewhat against Rika, but then completely swept Hassel. Against Geeta's Glamora, it knocked it out in a single surf. I didn't send Lokix out against the Elite Four, but against Gita it one-shot Espathra and helped pick up the slack left by the rest of the team. Swalot also didn't participate much in the Elite Four, but against Gita it nearly defeated Go-Goat, and likely would have if RNG had been a little kinder. Finally, Palmot performed well across multiple fights, helping against both Poppy and Larry, and holding its own against Gita. Now, the home stretch of the game is a lot of fights against trainers with large balanced teams, and when I'm fighting a opponent trainer with a balanced team, I like to have one of my team members go against one of their team members in a series of 6 one-on-ones, because it's just fun and it tests how each Pokemon performs pretty evenly. Using that method, I cleared pretty much everyone up until Toro except Nemona, the only failure of which being Talonflame against Orthworm. But against Toro, things got a bit tougher. Lokix and Talonflame both had poor type matchups and lost their one-on-one fights. Swalot was assigned to Iron Valiant and actually performed better than expected. It survived one hit that brought it to about half health, but the second hit was a critical hit that knocked it out. But it did manage to leave Iron Valiant on only 1 HP, so if things had gone a little better, Swalot would have won. Meanwhile, Palmot, Tatsugiri, and Dugtrio all won their matchups, and Dugtrio was even able to clean up one of the remaining threats afterwards. For the final tiers, I have under S tier Palmot, regularly picked up slack when other team members failed, rarely collapsed outright and contributed across the Elite Four, Gita, Nemona, and Turo fights. Palmot didn't completely dominate the run, but it was consistently reliable and never disappeared when the team needed it. Under A tier, I have Tatsugiri, who swept the Dragon Elite Four and easily removed Gita's Glamora. It won several key one-on-one matchups and only really struggled when its typing was heavily countered. I also have Lokix as an A tier, very strong in specific matchups. It functions more like a surgical strike than a team carry, but when used correctly it performs extremely well. For B tier, I have Swalot, surprisingly durable. Even in losing situations, it was able to stall out opponents or create openings for the rest of the team. And in C tier, I have Talonflame, who is very fast but lacked the finishing power I expected because its best fire type options didn't fully take advantage of its attack stat. And Dugtrio, who was occasionally useful for cleanup but far too fragile to rely on consistently. Under pressure, it often fainted before accomplishing anything. It's pretty much a glass cannon, but without the cannon, more like a glass sling. The next experiment I did was in Pokemon Legends Arceus, which is another game that doesn't follow the traditional Pokemon formula, but in a very different way than Pokemon Violet. Instead of removing progression roadblocks, this game dramatically reduces the importance of traditional Pokemon battles. Many of the major milestones involve things like running for your life while throwing snacks at giant glowing Pokemon, rather than standard trainer fights. Because of that, it's harder to use the usual milestones to evaluate team performance. I did try to send my Pokemon out against each of the Frenzied Nobles at least once during their fights, but those encounters don't really function like normal battles, so the more meaningful benchmarks for this run ended up being the trainer battles. And those are a little unusual too, since they often involve one of your Pokemon getting jumped by multiple opponents at once. Because of all this, the results from this run need to be taken with a grain of salt. Unfortunately, that's a little unavoidable because Legends Arceus is also the only game where I can easily test most trait evolutions thanks to the link cable item. Another difference is the endpoint of the playthrough. Normally I run each experiment until the credits roll, but in Legends Arceus the credits only appear after completing the entire Pokédex and catching Arceus. I don't have time for that, and that would not contribute to the test. So for this test, the run ends with the Volo and Giratina battle, which functions as the game's real final challenge anyway. For this run, my team was Steelix, Walrein, Machamp, Jolteon, Sudowoodo, and Honchkrow. I caught Eevee and Machop in the Obsidian Fieldlands, Onix, Bonsly, and Murkrow in the Crimson Mirelands, and Spheal in the Cobalt Coastlands. For each Pokemon, I went out and caught them as soon as I had enough mobility to reasonably reach their locations. Because progress in Legends Arceus requires filling out the Pokedex, my team also had a large number of temporary substitutes, rotating in and out during the run. Altogether, there were probably 40 or more Pokemon that temporarily filled team slots while I worked on research tasks. Going into the run, I expected Sudowoodo and Onix to be the weakest members of the team, at least until it evolved into Steelix. Meanwhile, Jolteon was the only Pokemon on the team that I had had significant experience using before, so I expected it to be the most reliable. Unfortunately, this is another run where I didn't take detailed notes, so a lot of the playthrough itself I'm reconstructing from memory, and I don't remember pretty much anything about it. I don't remember anything from the Cleavor fight, and most of the game is faded into just vague impressions, so I can't tell you much about how it went. One part that I do remember is the Volo battle. The Volo fight took me around half a dozen attempts. In several of those attempts, either Honchkrow or Jolteon managed to defeat Volo's full team, only for the run to immediately collapse once Giratina entered the fight. On the final attempt, however, Walrein ended up being the last Pokemon standing, and it managed to defeat Origin Form Giratina by itself to secure the victory. That moment ended up defining the final rankings for the run. For the final rankings of the run, they are Walrein is in S tier. Every time I needed Walrein, it exceeded expectations. It consistently delivered strong damage, took hits well, and ultimately defeated Origin Giratina by itself in the final battle. The A tiers are Machamp, who has high attack, solid bulk, and extremely reliable damage output. It rarely felt like dead weight and consistently contributed when needed. Steelix provided a strong defensive backbone for the team. In many situations, it actually covered the role I originally expected Sudowoodo to fill, and it held up well even under late game pressure. Honchkrow applied strong offensive pressure throughout the run and helped clean up several difficult fights. It also performed well during the Volo battle attempts. B tier had Jolteon in it. Jolteon was reliable when used, but not particularly central to the team's success. It did its job when needed, but it rarely carried any major fights. I had no C tiers, but my first D tier of the test is Sudowoodo. He never really justified its place on the team. Steelix ended up filling its intended niche much more effectively, and Sudowoodo rarely created meaningful value in battles. It also slowed down grinding periods due to its lower overall impact, and he just wasn't contributing to the team at all. It's worth noting that I made these rankings immediately after defeating Volo. While I don't have detailed notes to defend my decisions, these rankings were made while the experience was still fresh in my mind. These are just my experiences with these Pokemon, and your experience may have been very different depending on the game or team you used. If you had a different run with them, I'd love to hear about it in the comments, and if you'd like to follow along as I work through the long process of ranking every Pokemon line, feel free to subscribe.